Hey everybody, welcome to the OMG Tarot podcast. No horses this week. Yes, there are going to be horses eventually, but not this week. However, this week is going to be kind of an adjacent topic. We're once again going to be looking at imagery and symbols in the tarot and thinking in pictures. Because really with tarot, that's what you're doing. You're thinking in pictures and you're understanding specific images as messages. And when you have different elements together to make up one larger image, you stack those on top of each other and find multiple messages and find how do they merge together. Like for a quick example, let's take a look at our Ten of Pentacles. We've got images of dogs, we've got images of young children and elderly people, we've got grapes, we've got a castle. Individually, each of these things carries meaning, but then put them together into one whole image, now they fit together and they create a larger, more layered meaning. If you've ever studied graphic design or art history, you've probably come across the idea of composition. That's how an image is constructed, so things like how large are different pieces of this image in relation to each other, where are they placed, and where is the viewer's eyes drawn. Those same principles come into play when you're working with tarot cards. We're going to talk a bit about that this week, but specifically, I want to focus in on how the four elements are represented across the deck, because as we talked about primarily in our court card episodes, so if you missed those, go back and give those a listen. They have titles like the Pages, the Pentacles, the Queens, and the Knights. We talked a bit about the four elements and how each of them rules one of the minor arcana suits and what that means for you as the reader. Even though each suit has its element, there are also visual references to the other three suits in each of its cards. One of the best examples is the Six of Swords. We know the swords are all about the element of air, but there's quite a lot of water on this card, and we know that in tarot, water is emotions. Does that mean that this is an emotional card? Yes, there are emotions at play, and the water that's on the card is there to represent those emotions. Nothing you do occurs in a vacuum. There's always going to be some element of emotion in a logical decision or grounding in a choice of action. And knowing how to identify how these things are visually represented in the deck can help you pull more meaning out of each card's illustration. In this episode, we're going to zero in on a lot of those ways the different elements are represented visually. And also we're going to talk about how to read the negative space in a tarot card, because what isn't in a card can be just as important to its meaning as what is in it. So grab your deck and let's start taking a look. Before we start identifying visual representations of the four elements, let's do a quick recap of what those four elements are. If you're familiar with astrology, these are the exact same four elements that you apply to the zodiac signs. In fact, they mean the same exact things, and this is why knowing astrology can make you a stronger tarot card reader. And to an extent, knowing tarot can make you a better astrologer, but I think one of those skills is definitely more helpful for the other than in reverse. And I think it's simply because knowing astrological associations and things like ruling planets and elements can make it easier to see what a tarot artist was going for in their illustration. But in reverse, I've never found it particularly helpful to have a deck of tarot cards by my side while I'm interpreting a natal chart. It can't hurt, and sometimes maybe it can be helpful to think in terms of tarot themes and archetypes as you interpret that chart, but I've just never found that to be as helpful as it's been to know astrology when looking at tarot. But those four elements, they are water, fire, earth, and air. Let's talk about water first, because we kind of already started talking about it in my example earlier. Water is emotions. In tarot, when you see water, whether that's a river, or ocean waves, or raindrops, or even things like snow and ice, they symbolize emotions. It symbolizes other intangible things you can feel as well, like a sense or your intuitive feelings. It's all the things that maybe you can't necessarily pin down or find the exact precise vocabulary words for, but you know it when you feel it. Emotions can be strong motivators. Think about how often you do something because you wanted how it would make you feel, or you did it because it made you feel good. And emotions aren't the opposite of logic. I know sometimes we act like, oh, logic versus emotion. How often are your feelings completely driven by logic? You feel a certain way because you had a certain experience. It sounds pretty logical to me. In astrology, the three zodiac signs that are water signs are Cancer, Pisces, and Scorpio. And in tarot, water has to do with the suit of cups. You'll see water in most, but not all, of the cups cards. And that is if you're working with a Rider-Waite-Smith deck. A few I'm going to call out specifically are the Three of Cups, the Six of Cups, and the Seven of Cups. The Seven of Cups is that one where we have that silhouetted figure whose back is turned to the viewer, and they're looking up at seven offerings up in the clouds, and we've got all different things coming out of these cups. We've got a guy wearing a ghost outfit, we've got some candy, we've got a dragon, we've got all kinds of things, but notably, none of them are water, and none of them are even sea creatures. It's not even like, how the Page of Cups has his fish coming out of the cup. We don't even have one of those. I wouldn't read this scenario as being completely devoid of emotion because it is a Cups card, so inherently it is an emotional situation to be in. But because we don't see any water here, I'm reading this as I don't think the figure is necessarily considering their feelings or really strongly in touch with them. I think this is all, well, take a look at where it is. It's up in the clouds, it's air, it's all theoretical and it's all abstract, but I'm reading it as I don't think they really know what's in their heart and what they need, or that all the competing ideas and possibilities are making it difficult for them to get in touch with their true emotions. Another example of a Cups card that doesn't have prominent water on it is our Two of Cups. That's the one where we've got the two people clinking glasses and that chimera lion up above them. They're two people meeting, presumably for the first time, and there's no water. Does that mean that this isn't an emotional scenario? I don't necessarily think so, but I'm looking at, in addition to the water that's not here, what is here? Feet planted firmly on the ground, a hill in the background with a little house on it. There's a lot of earth energy factored into this card, and you see that in the rolling green hills and the grass and the lushness, and the feet planted firmly on the ground. So maybe we could read this as these two coming together are grounding each other. Maybe we can read it as this is a very secure connection, and it's one that's rooted, and if they continue to nurture it, they'll grow into something bigger and more abundant. Because when we see things like foliage and a lot of ground on a card, that's earth energy. Just like whenever water shows up on a card, whether it's a Cups card or not, that symbolizes emotions. Clear depictions of earth are symbolic of earth energy, which your earth signs are Taurus, Capricorn, and Virgo, and earth energy is the pentacles. It's all those things that ground you and keep you stabilized and secure. It's money, it's tangible assets, but it's not only these things. It's more of the idea of what these things can buy, like options, a secure future, knowing that you have a safety net, and often this can even show up in tarot as the knowledge that you have a safety net, so you have the freedom to fail. I know that sounds a little specific or maybe even a little weird, but it came up in at least 2 readings that I did for clients recently, and it just stuck with me. This idea that a Pentacles card might show up to say, hey, you have all the things that you physically need, so bet on yourself. Start the small business. Go outside your comfort zone because for you, if you fail, you're not going to be economically ruined. It was this idea of like, hey, because you've got this safety net here, why not take a chance on yourself? I wouldn't advise that if they didn't have such a safety net, but sometimes we got things like 9s and 10s of Pentacles that go, hey, you know what, if you fail, it's not the end of the world. Try. So here's another card that often eludes people, and it has representations of both earth and water energy, despite being a card that belongs to neither of these corresponding suits. The Eight of Wands. That's the one that doesn't have any people on it, just the 8 wands that are shooting across the scene, kind of like a set of missiles. With it being a wands card, we know it's fiery, and we know it's all about passion and motivation and drive and all those fiery things. But take a look down at the bottom. We've got a rolling green hill with a small house on it all the way in the distance, and a winding, very calm river. Why did I call out the calmness of the river? Well, because when you see water depicted on a tarot card, pay attention to what the water's doing. Is it still? Is it churning? Is it wavy? Take a look over at your Two of Pentacles. That water is, those are some huge waves. That reminds me of the movie poster for The Perfect Storm. Not only does water signify emotion, what the water is doing signifies the kind of emotion that's present here. So, still water can indicate very calm, cooling emotions versus big waves can indicate stress. Taking a look back at our Eight of Wands here, this water's calm. So, from that, we can understand that things aren't necessarily all a high strung, high stress situation. Rather, the emotional component of the scenario we're reading about is at least very relaxed and flowing. And knowing what we know about the Eight of Wands, this is leading all the way into your passion, and it's a lot of movement and a lot of drive and motivation, which you would think would be a pretty emotional situation, right? I would think so. But with the calm water here, I'm reading that as getting into a flow state, that perhaps you're just so locked in on what you're doing that you feel a-okay with it. You don't feel specifically very strongly right now. You just feel like, I feel what I'm doing. I feel perfectly fine with these actions and where they're going to take me, because let's take a look at the earth representation here. We've got quite a bit of it. So I think that even while things are kind of going all over the place and you might feel like you're being stretched to your limits and pulled and pushed because of this Eight of Wands, we also know that you're very grounded in what you're doing. You're secure in the choices you're making and the actions that you're taking because of those choices. And that house. Houses in tarot are security. And yeah, it might be a bit far away, but I think you're very secure in what you're doing. I think this is a very all systems go card for me that, yeah, you might be being asked to do a lot, but I think it's very aligned, and I think that emotionally, you can trust it. Trust the process. That's something that I would say about the Eight of Wands. Let's compare it to the Four of Wands, because this is another Wands card that has a house on it, but the house is far more prominent here. What can we read in that? Maybe we can read that the couple who are in the focal point of this card are feeling very close to their sense of home and they're feeling very secure, and it makes sense. Look at them. They're at what appears to be a wedding. They're starting their new life together and establishing their home as a married couple. Which you would think there'd be more water on this card, right? I don't know why there isn't water on this card. If I was designing a Four of Wands, I probably would put some water on the card. But anyway, here's what we do have. We have that big giant castle symbolizing all the security and sturdiness of the situation these two are in. And we also have quite a lot of foliage, which is abundance. That's earth energy. So this is a very earthy card. And if you know what fours are grounding and they're staying inside the box and they're this sense of a pause and some security within the suit that they are. So that's very earthy in itself. So it makes a lot of sense to me that, of course, there's a lot of themes of grounding and stability and security in this card. I'm just a little surprised there's not more water, because that's emotional. But also, this card isn't explicitly about weddings or marriages. No card is that explicit about anything, but I typically read this as reaching a plateau point in what it is you're driven to do. So for a relationship spread, I would read this as a wedding or an engagement or moving in together. And in a career spread, I might read it as a promotion or a sense of blooming where you're planted, that it's not time to go job hopping right now. Make the best of where you are right here and right now, because you're very secure in this role and this company. Also, maybe the cynic in me also sees some performativity in this card, because also take a look at it. It does kind of look like a stage. We have what appears to be a very clear stage cutting across the bottom portion of this card, and the wedding huppah looks like it's a set piece, and then that house does actually kind of look like a backdrop. Are these people just characters in a play, and their characters are getting married? I've never interpreted this card that way, but also drop it into the story of the Ace through 10. We're less than halfway there. How secure can we really be? How well versed in our passion, because this is the wands, are we really at this point? Could this be settling at an early stage? Could this be you kind of faking it till you make it? Now, for some additional context, Pamela Coleman Smith, the woman who illustrated your Rider-Waite-Smith deck, did a lot of stagecraft as part of her career. She was so fascinating, and before this month is over, we're actually going to have an episode just about her and how she took a lot of ideas that were present in earlier tarot decks and created what we now know as the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, because March is Women's History Month, at least in the United States, and I think we gotta celebrate the woman who brought us this tarot deck. Otherwise, we'd all be reading with Marseille decks and maybe the Toth deck. And that's not a bad thing. I actually kind of like Marseille decks. But we have this deck thanks to Pamela Coleman Smith, so of course I'm going to talk about her on here. But to backtrack a bit to my statements about, is this marriage performative? Those questions aren't necessarily rhetorical. I want you to actually think about that. When you look at this card, what are you interpreting? Is this something that's actually happening, or is it something that's being put on and performed? And remember, you can find a lot of clues to that in terms of where does this fit in on our scale of Ace to 10? What suit are we looking at? What other little clues do we have? Like, we have that castle, we have the people who are celebrating, we have all of the plants and things here, which typically signify abundance. We also have, and maybe this is a coincidence, but we have a structure that looks really similar to that bridge that's on the Five of Cups. Is it a coincidence? That's up to you to decide. Because remember, tarot cards are open to interpretation. That's why we do this. And I'm trying to help you find ways to find your best interpretations and to have the vocabulary and the tools to interpret them effectively. And maybe, depending on the context and what your eyes are most drawn to, and even what you're reading about, in some spreads you might read the Four of Wands as a straight up authentic thing. You might read it as an absolutely just straightforward, unironic telling of, yes, bloom where you're planted. You're doing what you need to be doing, and yeah, absolutely grow here where you're placed right now. Don't keep reaching for more and more and more. Or you might read it as that fake it till you make it idea, and that sense of you're doing great from the outside. Are you really ready to settle on the inside, or are you just really doing a lot of things for show? Where are you with what it is you're pursuing? Because it's still a wand. It's still about pursuits, action, motivation, all of those things. So to stay in the wand suit a bit, another card that I really like to illustrate this idea is our Seven of Wands. That's the one where the guy in the green tunic has a whole lot of wands stuck in the ground around him, and he's got another big one. He looks kind of frantic. But let's take a look at what's beneath his feet. Look at that ground. It's lumpy. Unlike that very straight, secure ground that the couple on the Four of Wands is standing on, this guy doesn't really look like he has super even footing. In fact, he's grounded, but it looks like he's really kind of flexing and moving his body to keep himself situated. And we also see some water on the ground. It's not a lot, but take a look. It is there. This guy feels, but maybe he only feels a little bit. Maybe he's so much more concerned with staying upright and staying stable that he doesn't have a whole lot of time to feel. And I think looking at his face, yeah, I wouldn't have a whole lot of time to examine my feelings too deeply if I was in that scenario either. You know who else doesn't have a whole lot of time to examine their feelings due to the scenario they're in? The woman on the Eight of Swords. She's blindfolded. Is this literal or figurative? That's another question I want you to think about. And looking at her card to find indications of the different elements at play, let's start at her feet. We see she's on the ground, but this ground is also lumpy. She's really not all that different from Mr. Seven of Wands, is she? This ground is lumpy and ushy and squishy, and there is quite a bit of water on it. The water is still, and it's shallow. What can we read into that? Maybe her emotions are, well, They're pretty consistent. They're not all over the place. But also, let's pay attention to their depth. They're not that deep. And how could they be? She's blindfolded. What else isn't she able to see? Well, she's not able to see that mountain in the background with the castle on it. I think we can all agree that she's rather detached from any sense of security, that perhaps she feels detached from any sort of home and any sort of safe place to go. She sure isn't rooted in where she is. But also, how is air represented on this card? Because it is a swords card, so we gotta find some air somewhere. Aside from this being about matters of the mind, and we can just, because of the suit that it is, know that this largely has to do with her thoughts, her beliefs, her ideas, all of those mental things. Take a look at her hair. The way her hair is blowing indicates that there's a light breeze going on. Not like high winds like we see on some other swords cards, but a light breeze that appears to be blowing into her face. Her hair is being pulled away from her face. I might read this as somehow knowledge is still finding her, although she's not looking at all the information that perhaps she should be looking at, or to take the should out of it, all the information that exists and is available to her. We still somehow have reality and knowledge prevailing through that symbolic breeze. Because I want to actually compare her to another swords card, our Two of Swords. Once again, we have this motif of a blindfolded woman surrounded by swords, but that's where the comparisons end. Over on R2, she's holding the swords. She's pretty secure with those swords, and if we want to read it figuratively, she's pretty secure with what she knows. We can also pull from this how she's positioned. She's seated on a stable, straight ground, unlike Miss Eight of Swords, who's all on that muddy, gushy ground. Two of Swords is comfortably seated, or it looks like it's made of concrete. Maybe it's not that comfortable, but nonetheless, her feet are firmly on the ground. She's grounded. She's rooted. She feels very secure in where she currently is. But her back is to the water. Unlike the Eight, whose back is to a mountain and a home, and the challenges that the mountain represents and the security that the home represents, and putting them together, this idea that home is just kind of out of reach right now. The Two is not looking at the emotions, and that water's pretty calm. There are some ripples in it, but it's not wavy and crazy. It's definitely, for the most part, relatively subdued water, and it's got bits of ground coming out of it. It's got a rock and an island, and then there's the horizon line, so there is security and stability behind her, and she's not looking at it. Our Lady on the Two of Swords also isn't looking up at the moon, which I think we might even just do a whole episode on moon symbolism, or perhaps an episode with just celestial symbolism in general, because that's a whole topic unto itself. But the long and short of it is, the moon represents what's hidden and what's running underneath the surface, the shadow side, and Miss Two isn't looking at it. She doesn't recognize it yet. And to get back to my original point about the Eight, when we compare the 8 and the 2, let's drop them onto that story of Ace through the 10. 2 is very close to the beginning. Perhaps the lady on 2 is so sure that she knows everything she needs to know with those two swords she's gripping onto because of the Dunning-Kruger effect. She doesn't know what she doesn't know yet, versus over on 8, perhaps all those other swords that she's not in control of, and they're all a lot more loosey-goosey strewn around, can be symbolic of everything that she's aware that she doesn't know and understand yet. So as we've progressed through the suit of the swords, we've become more and more knowledgeable and more aware of everything that we don't know, and just a bit more savvy in that regard. So maybe 8 of Swords needs to be away from home. Maybe staying home would have meant never growing intellectually. Maybe she had to strike out on her own so she could have experiences and know things. I don't know, am I putting too much on a tarot card? I might be. So a lot of the depictions of the elements in minor arcana cards are super obvious. Like, on our Two of Swords, there's lots of water. We see it, it's water. But are there some more subtle depictions? Yes. The best example I can pull out of the deck is the Five of Pentacles. That's the one where the people are all bundled up in the snow, really not doing so great, and there's that stained glass window behind them. It's snow. Snow is water. So when you read this card, read it with that in mind. These people, yeah, their feet are on the ground, but their feet are sinking into the snow, and it's snowing around them. Sure, this is a Pentacles card, and broadly it deals with concepts related to material items, money, stability, but this is such an emotionally charged situation. How grounded can they possibly be? Can they even feel the ground through all that snow? The snow is probably making their feet numb because at least one of these people isn't wearing any shoes. Could it be that just the overwhelming emotions are making you unable to feel grounded in any sort of way? Remember, it's a five, and fives are all about things not really lining up quite right and feeling like they're kind of off kilter. So perhaps that's why they're off kilter, because there's just so much water energy here and just so much emotions flooding them that they can't even see straight, they can't even feel like they're standing upright. And when you read cards with this kind of attention to detail, you add layers to their meaning. This isn't strictly, oh, things aren't quite balanced in the realm of my money and my assets. It's things aren't quite balanced in that realm, and I'm overwhelmed with a lot of intense emotions because snow isn't a nice, gentle rain and it's not a comfortable temperature. It's snow, it's cold, it accumulates. And yeah, if these people don't get some kind of help soon, all that snow is just going to accumulate and accumulate. And I think they're going to become further and further removed from any kind of stability. So when you're reading a tarot card, ask yourself, where is the water in this card? And pay attention to all forms of water: snow, ice, still water, dew, anything like that. And apply that to the other elements as well. Look for indications of anything earthy, so that may be a flower, a tree, a shrub, a bush, anything like that. And in your Rider Waite Smith deck, grapes. Why did Pamela Coleman Smith love grapes so much? I don't know. I mean, grapes are good. It might have just been that simple. And then you've got air and fire, which are often depicted a little more subtly because, well, how are you going to depict air? We can depict it the way we saw in the Eight of Swords through showing the character's hair is kind of blowing and implying that there's a breeze. So look for that. Look for trees bending over and look for sails being propelled by wind. Any kind of indication that there's air energy moving through the scene can speak to you about, well, air energy, swords energy, thoughts, reality, logic, the truth, knowledge, that kind of stuff being relevant to the picture that you're decoding. Fire is the same way. We can find a literal fire, but also look for things like candles. Look for the sun. Look for bonfires. The sun is a giant ball of fire. So that's relevant. That's fire energy. It's drive, it's passion, it's motivation. And then you might also find literal wands. That's particularly in the Rider Waite Smith deck. She used the image of the wand, which might or might not have leaves growing out of it, which is again something you can interpret. The leaves are earth energy, so you might see a wand, but you might see a lot of leaves growing off of it. It's passion and drive that's growing into abundance. What is it producing? And also, pay attention to what's absent. Some of the best cards to look at that negative space in cards, so to speak, are the court cards for the wand suit, because a lot of them are set in deserts. Take a look at that backdrop. I've got the page, the king, and the queen pulled up right now. None of them has any water in their background. They don't have any trees either, and I don't see any indication that there's air or wind going on. Are these people just pure fire? Well, maybe you'll read something into how firmly their feet are planted on the ground and find some earth grounding energy there. Or you might look at the leaves growing off the wands on the page and the king, oh, and the queen, and read that at least they're channeling all that fiery motivation into producing something. But why don't they have water? And why don't they have seemingly much air or any kind of grapes or flowers, except the queen? She's got her sunflower. Maybe these people are just running on pure vibes. Maybe they're running on just pure motivation. Maybe they're running on spite. I mean, that's pretty fiery. You ever heard like that quote or that phrase, surviving purely out of spite? Well, that's pretty fiery to me. I don't know. That just feels like it's giving like Mars energy. Aries driven by Mars would show up out of spite. And hey, showing up out of spite is showing up, isn't it? So, whether you tend to show up to things out of spite or out of desire or for really any of your motivations, I hope you learned something today. The four elements are one of the most important frameworks to work with when you're reading your tarot deck because they determine what area of your life is each card, and by extension, each reading you do speaking about. And it goes both ways. The cards that aren't showing up are communicating to you what's not present. Like, let's say you did a pull and all three of the cards you pull are Cups cards. We can surmise it's a very emotionally charged situation, but also we can surmise you're not thinking super logically and you're not super grounded. And I'm not sure there's really a whole lot of progress happening because look at what's not going on here. We don't have any swords or pentacles or wands. And this isn't just something to apply in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck either. Almost every deck you work with is going to incorporate this kind of symbolism in some kind of way. And some artists might have really abstract styles, or they might really depart from the traditional depictions of these, but the four elements are there regardless of the deck you're working with. And it can be an interesting experiment to take a look through different decks you have and see how did each artist choose to depict each card's essence? What other elements are they referencing in them? And did they make different choices than Pamela Coleman Smith made, or different choices than another artist made? And then think about why. Why do you suppose the artist made the design choices they made? And if you were to design a tarot deck, how would you communicate each card? So think on that, have fun with it, be creative with it, because tarot is inherently just a very creative hobby, so have a good time with it. And tune in next week for the next episode of the OMG Tarot podcast. I'm going to try my best to stick to that Thursday schedule. Things have been a little busy over here at House OMG, but I'm doing my best over here. In the meantime, if you want to follow me on Instagram, give me a follow over at its_OMG_tarot. I also have a TikTok where it's just OMG Tarot. I don't post there as much as I'd like to, and ideally that's going to change. You can also head over to my website, read my blog, omgtarot.com, and you can also, if you enjoyed this episode, give me a good review on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. That sort of thing really does help, and I really appreciate it every single time I get a review, or a follow, and a follow. So, that's my spiel for the end of this episode. You've probably heard it before, but if you're tuning in for the first time, there it is. All right, talk to you soon. Bye-bye.